Hello and welcome to Module 1B for Ethics and Society, Philosophy 1009. And this week in this module, we're going to ask ourselves, what is morality? Can we define it? Can we distinguish it? And can we distinguish it also from ethics? So that is essentially what we want to do in this particular module. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, can we define morality? And we can in terms of what that means philosophically. And that is that moral philosophy is the study of what morality is and what is required of us. The second half of that statement is particularly important because what morality is about is what is required of us to act morally, to act ethically, to act socially, and ultimately to act with one another. Because morality has a lot to do with behavior and not controlling it in a negative sense, but being able to ask people, what are the duties that you would have as a citizen to act responsibly, to act honorably, to act well? So moral philosophy is the study of what that consists of. So morality is, first of all, it's a set of principles, right? It's a set of principles that are about the distinction between right and wrong. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But sometimes it happens that a situation arises where a distinction is a bit murky. What if I had to lie to a friend, because, they just don't look really nice in that pair of pants I just bought? What do I do, right? How do I distinguish between right and wrong? Do I lie to that person just the one time to make them feel better, but then I run the risk of somebody else coming out and saying something really rude and obnoxious to them, and I could have stopped that? So do I lie to her and possibly have repercussions later on? Or am I deontologist and I choose never to lie? And I tell that person, no, you look awful in those pants. They're not your color. They're too tight. They're too whatever. Either way, that simple little scenario is an indication of one of two different sets of principles that you're going to use to define what is right and wrong. Do I lie because it's convenient? Oh, I'm a utilitarian. Or do I never lie, tell this person the truth? I'm a deontologist. Or I am an ethicist. Either way, morality is about deciding what is right and wrong in terms of the distinctions between the two and good and bad behavior. So if that's the case, morality has to do with the values that I believe in that will tell me what is right and wrong and how to act accordingly. So it's a particular system of human values and principles of conduct. So the human values part, that's morality. The principles of conduct, that's ethics. So when we talk about ethics, we're talking about the behavior of people in a society that act according to higher principles. Not what's in it for me, or what's convenient for me, or what's the easiest way out of here, but something a little bit higher, right? I'm thinking of the overall setup of society, and I'm thinking about the way in which my behavior may impact my friend, both the two of us speaking, but that person then going off somewhere else and possibly not putting themselves in harm's way, but leaving themselves open to, a nasty statement by somebody else. So if I choose to tell that person the truth and, no, you don't look really that nice in those pants, maybe a different color, maybe a different style, I've now satisfied my criteria of what I think is right and wrong. I should tell her the truth. And at the same time, I've also told my friend, said, listen, isn't that what you want? Would you rather me lie and then have somebody else insult you? It's something simple like that, but it carries a lot of weight because it defines who you are. So the morality part of us is the system of human values, and those values can come from anywhere. Your religious upbringing, your family upbringing, the community you belong to, the organizations you belong to as a child or as an adult. So the morality, the moral system, comes from that because it's something that people share. Where we are distinguishing ourselves from each other is how we express that value system. And that is the ethical behavior that we conduct on a day-to-day basis. So what we're left with is this. If morality is a set of principles or values concerning the distinction between what is right and wrong, then what is ethics? Ethics, as I've just mentioned, has to do with choosing how to behave correctly. how to choose between good and bad behavior, whether or not to lie, whether or not to use somebody as a means to an end. Let's say your friend has just got a new kick-ass 4K TV and he just wants you, hey, I want you to come over and watch a certain movie. Well, you're not really a huge fan of this person, but hey, they got an awesome television, so let's go check it out. That's using a person as a means to an end. The end is to watch the movie. The means is you're going to kind of lie to this person and tell them that, yeah, we're tight, we're good, but you're really not. So you have to decide what you think is right and wrong. And the way in which you express that decision is through your ethical behavior. So it has to do with choosing good and bad behavior and our ability to choose one form of behavior over another as the right one. So it's an expression of our outward expression of our morality, that value system, as well as the kind of behavior that informs others what we think of values, what we think of moral values. Because if you are a kind person, then the people that you know on a daily basis, or that you even may encounter just one time, can see pretty quickly what kind of person you are. And you want to leave behind, a statement that says that I'm a good person, as opposed to I'm a horrible person and I'm going to take advantage of every chance I get. So don't trust me. That's not what you want. Now, in what follows here, we're going to have some scenarios that are, yes, controversial. Now, controversial not because, kids under 18 shouldn't be looking at this. They're controversial because the two positions that are looked at are equally valid. So we talked in Module 1A about the difference between utilitarianism and deontology. And in the following scenarios, as difficult as they are, we're going to see them played out. And you'll see sometimes how difficult those positions can be to maintain. So the two are utilitarianism, or the greatest good, or deontology, or the sanctity of life, in this particular case. Deontology also has to do with, again, lying, using people as a means to an end. But in this case, it's going to be the difference between the greater good, in other words, helping more people, or in one case, helping one person, versus the sanctity of life, the fact that life is precious and should not be snuffed out under any conditions. So here's the first one. The first one is about baby Teresa. And baby Teresa was born with anencephaly, which is where a part of the brain, the cerebrum and the cerebellum, are missing. And that is important because that is the part of the brain that tells the rest of the body how to function. So without it, you are essentially just biologically alive. You're not really a sentient being because you can't think on your own. You can't operate your limbs on your own, open and close your eyelids. The most basic functions you cannot do. So if you are missing that part of your brain, you are living almost just biologically. Now, the parents of baby Teresa wished to volunteer her organs for immediate transplant immediately after she was born. But in Florida, the Florida law prohibited the removal of organs until the donor was completely dead. Regardless of the age, regardless of the condition, the law was very strict. You cannot remove the organs of a person until they are dead. Neither are you allowed to accelerate the death in order to harvest those organs. So as you can imagine, by the time baby Teresa died 9 days later, her organs were too far gone. They hadn't functioned for over a week. So they deteriorated and they could not be used. So that is essentially the dilemma. We have the parents of baby Teresa, who, by the way, knew that their child was born without that part of the brain, but because they didn't believe in abortion, they thought, okay, let's find the silver lining here, which was, let's allow baby Teresa to be born. Maybe for lucky, she's still born, and then we can turn around and we can donate or volunteer her organs for other children. But that was not the case. Baby Teresa clung to life for 9 more days. So here are the arguments. And the first one here is a utilitarian argument. The benefit is, if we can help someone without harming anyone else, we ought to do so. Not we must, but we ought to do so. Now, the verb ought is what's called a conditional verb. If certain conditions are met, we ought to do this. And in morality, the conditional verb, or the conditional tense, is very important because ought and should are important terms that we need to use when we discuss a particular position that we wish to maintain. So the benefits here for baby Teresa is that if we can benefit someone without harming anyone else, we ought to do so. So transplanting organs would benefit other sick and dying children without actually harming baby Teresa, because she is essentially in a biological state. She is not a sentient being that can operate on her own. She never will, because she does not have that part of the brain that allows her to do that. So, on the other hand, would be the deontological or the ethicist argument, which says that we should not use people as a means to an end. The end is, of course, to harvest and transplant the organs, and baby Teresa would be the means by which this could be achieved. So ethicists are arguing that it is wrong to use people as a means to an end because it violates their autonomy. So we are born with autonomy, selfhood. We should be able to decide what to do to ourselves, with ourselves, and we should also refrain from others doing things to us. But essentially, this is what happens to baby Teresa. Because she is not a sentient being, her autonomy, we'll put in quotations, is problematic. Because she's not a functioning autonomous being. She has a portion of her brain missing, which means that she is unable to function as a regular human being. Regular in the sense of being able to take care of herself. So the question becomes, what is in the best interest of baby Teresa? So if she could speak, what do you think she would say? Please harvest my organs because I'm not going to live, or I am an autonomous being. I wish to remain alive for as long as I can. All of these things become not hypotheticals, but actually are a fundamental part of the argument, because we are violating the autonomy of baby Teresa if we accelerate her death. In other words, take her off any kind of life support system and allow her to die, which Florida law refrains from doing or allowing doctors to do it. Now remember, even in Florida, even the hospital was on the side of the parents of baby Teresa, but it was Florida law, which exists external to the hospital, says absolutely no way. They could not do it. So here is the argument that ethicists or deontologists make against killing another person. So not only are you violating their autonomy, you are using them as a means to an end, but it says that it is wrong to kill another person to save someone. So if that's the case, would that apply under all conditions? So if it is wrong to kill one person to save another, what happens in killing in self-defense? How does that square up, right? Can you square that circle and say under no conditions? So would you let yourself be killed if you are a deontologist and not allowed to kill someone else in self-defense? It's very difficult. So we're not saying that deontologists are wrong, but if you argue that particular point, killing in self-defense becomes a very effective way to knock down this notion that we should never, ever, which is a deontological position, never, ever kill one person to save another. Killing in self-defense or killing to save your family, that seems to fit into a different category. So if it's wrong to kill one person to save another, is that effective all the time? Is that true all the time? And in the case of baby Teresa, the doctors were unable to harvest her organs because they allowed her to live too long. She survived too long for the organs to be useful. And what would have been a utilitarian argument to harvest those organs, allow her to die and harvest the organs, did not play out. They were not successful. And instead, the deontological position that the Florida law had taken, which is against killing people to use them, again, as a means to an end, it eventually won the day. So a very difficult way to look at these two positions, but it is a highly effective one. So maybe we could find another way around this and argue that perhaps baby Teresa is, in a sense, already dead. Because if she is not a sentient being, an autonomous being, and is not able to function on her own, we need to then define not only what is death, but what is a human being. So that takes us down a different path. So in the case of baby Teresa, we could maybe argue that she was already dead. She was non-functioning. And as a result of situations like this, the definition of death has had to be reformulated. Now, when the heart stops beating, that can be one way in which we can say that someone is dead, but we can also keep someone alive on a ventilator, on a machine. Instead, when the brain stops functioning, in other words, brain death. So brain death is now the measure by which someone is truly considered dead. There is no brain activity, none whatsoever. In other words, the brain is not trying to keep any part of that human body alive. Even though the heart may stop beating, a machine could technically continue to allow that heart to beat. And therefore, if that is the case, the brain may continue to live and to function because it is getting blood to it. But once the brain shuts down, which in the case of baby Teresa, she did not even have that part of the brain that defines her as a human being, we could say that she is in a sense already dead. So somebody with anencephaly doesn't meet the technical requirement for death because they don't even have the brain to cease functioning. So by reformulating the terms of the argument, which is death, autonomy, human being, vegetative states, and all these kinds of things, we can see where there are different ways we can take that argument, still try to persuade the other side that you are right, but depending on which side you believe that is the correct one, this is the way in which you can do this. You can turn around and say, well, let's redefine the components of this argument. And the issue of baby Teresa is a very, very good example. Now, this is the second one of the three controversies. This is Jody Marie. And Jody and Marie were conjoined twins. As you can see in the image here, they were actually joined at the abdomen. And Jody, the stronger one we see on the lower right, was actually the stronger one because she had the heart that was pumping blood to both her and her sister. Now, the only hope for the two of them to continue to exist and to survive would be for an operation to separate the two, with Jody being the only one expected to live. Why? Because only Jody had the heart. Mary, in a sense, was a kind of almost an appendage that was living off of the heart and lungs of Jody. And the issue here is a different one. While the parents with baby Teresa may have been Catholic and didn't believe in abortion, the parents of Jody Marie were devout Catholics and refused permission that would accelerate in any way the death of either Mary or Jody. But in this particular case, according to the doctors, it would have been the death of Mary, almost 100%. So the hospital petitioned to overrule the parents in order to perform the operation, which they did. And Mary, of course, died, but Jody apparently is still alive. This is an issue, this like late 70s, early 80s, I believe. And Jody is still alive. So it was a success. Again, let's take a look at the arguments for and against, in a sense, bisecting the two conjoined twins in order to have one survive and the other, Mary, unfortunately pass away. So the argument here is that we should try to save as many people as we can. That is a kind of Hippocratic oath, right? And so the rationale for separating the twins is that you are going to save one, but you're also going to let another one die. So we have a choice. Do we let them live and both of them potentially die? Or do we purposefully separate the two and have Mary die, but the guarantee of Jody to survive? So if that's the case, if we in the long run, in the long term, lose both of them, is it not better to save one and let the other one pass away, but know that we can at least save one out of the two? So this is again a utilitarian argument. Now this is the deontological one, or the ethicist one, for the sanctity of life. We know the parents both loved their children, did not want to kill them, wanted to save both of them if they could, and their belief system, at the core of this belief system, was the sanctity of life. That we are under no pretense that we have the right to take away a person's life. It is not something we're allowed to do or should try to do. So the sanctity of life is at the core of certainly the Western moral tradition and the ethicist tradition, the Christian tradition, It is really the foundation, right? Thou shalt not kill. It's one of the commandments, one of the most important ones. But again, in certain situations, are there exceptions? What if that innocent life, in this case, Mary's life, had no future? We don't know, or even baby Teresa. This was a child born with a section of her brain that was not functioning. Are there exceptions where that child just will not have what's called a normal life? There would be long-term pain, physical handicaps, mental handicaps. So if that is what we know at this early point, and we know that an innocent life has no future, well, there's no wish to continue to live any longer. And so what should we do? If the sanctity of life is such, we still need to let both either baby Teresa or Jody Marie survive for as long as possible. We have no right to take away their life. So it is, again, a very difficult decision to make. But in the case of Jody Marie, the hospital, I believe the British hospital, overruled the parents, separated the twins who were conjoined, and Jody continues to live. So it was the right thing. And in this case here, we had a difference between a religious belief and a medical belief. The religious belief was the ethical or the ethicist sanctity of life. On the other hand, was the expertise of doctors. Their wisdom, their years of experience, their knowledge in these matters, and their belief that it was possible for one of those two kids to survive. So medical expertise and wisdom overruled the Christian sanctity of belief and the sanctity of life. So this is how this particular case played out. Now, the third one is possibly one that you may know, depending on other classes you may have taken at Fanshawe or elsewhere, which is the fairly recent story of Tracy Latimer. And Tracy Latimer was a Canadian. Her father, Robert Latimer, you see this picture there. 12-year-old Tracy Latimer had cerebral palsy, and she was euthanized by her father, Robert, that we see here. And although at first he denied to have committed this act, he eventually confessed and said, yes, it was him. He euthanized his daughter, and he was charged with second-degree murder. And so the Supreme Court ruled on this mandatory sentence for second-degree murder. Robert Latimer spent time in jail, in prison. And as a matter of fact, even when he came up for parole the first time, he was denied because there was a risk he might reoffend. He had only one child. He had two kids, but only one child that was physically disabled. But he was still denied because there was a chance he might reoffend. That is beside the point in this important case, but it is something where the law, when it comes in, it's going to be the full extent of the law. Just because of the circumstances, the law still saw it as second-degree murder. So, an argument against Mr. Latimer is that Tracy's life was precious. It was her own. She may have been an autonomous person. She could function a little bit, but over time became much worse. But the fact that her sanctity of life was overruled, her ability to live autonomously was overruled by Mr. Latimer's actions. And the Supreme Court, or at least the prosecution, argued that he had no right to kill her. He killed her because she was handicapped. And so in his defense, Mr. Latimer said that Tracy weighed less than 40 pounds, had the mental capacity of a 3-month-old child, and her prospects of life, again, in quotations, was biological. She was at the point of baby Teresa, obviously 12 years later, but her prospects of a human life, a functioning, autonomous human life, was biological at best because of the way in which she was deteriorating through her health. So once again, the arguments for and against. So the argument for the discrimination against the handicapped, this was something that became very important to proponents of people with disabilities, which was this, that Tracy was killed because she was handicapped. She was discriminated against because of her disability, and discriminated against by her father in the worst way possible. He took her life because he thought that she was hurt and was in such poor shape mentally, physically, and emotionally that it was better off for her to be euthanized. So Latimer denied that she was she was killed because of her disability, he said, okay, no, you're looking at it the wrong way. So he denied that she was killed because of her disability. Essentially, she was because she had cerebral palsy, but he qualified it by saying she was killed because she was suffering without hope. She was suffering because of her disability with no hope in sight. So the issue of being handicapped, yes, that was the reason why she was euthanized by a father, but he looked at it in terms of the future, as opposed to someone who feels that they're discriminated against because of their past, because of who they are at the present time. Latimer said, yes, the disability may have been the deciding factor, but she was euthanized, she was killed because she was suffering without hope. There was no chance of her of getting better. Now, when we make an argument like that, that's in the case of Mr. Latimer, that his daughter was already suffering and was going to get worse, that's called a slippery slope argument. And it is a rhetorical device that's used by people that, at its worst, it's used by people that don't know how to get out of an argument. And they say, well, if this happens, then that's going to happen. Okay, here's an example. If we accept mercy killing, then we might slide down a slippery slope where all life is cheapened. Let's say it isn't just handicapped people. We'll see in about 10 weeks from now when we look at euthanasia, eugenics, euthanasia as well, but eugenics in particular, that was the worst but the most real kind of slippery slope where first eugenics was allowing individuals to, well, in the name of eugenics, allowing individuals to be put to death because they had a mental deficiency. Then it was a physical deficiency. And sure enough, when you let a government do these kinds of things without any accountability, what happens? It gets worse. And in the case of eugenics in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, they definitely went down a slippery slope in the sense that eventually all life that was not considered perfect and Aryan was considered worthy of being killed. So whether you were Jewish, or you were homosexual, you were a gypsy, you were a leftist, you were whatever. All of a sudden, all life is cheapened when you start making the argument that we wish to purify the race, or we are willing to accept mercy killings because it's going to get rid of defective people. Well, then the definition becomes, what are defective people? Depends who you ask, right? So depends on who's also in power. So a slippery slope argument, to get back on track here, a slippery slope argument is an easy way to abuse the ability to argue a point. So if you are opposed to something, whatever that may be, if you're opposed to it and you have no real valid argument against it, let's say the person has kind of cornered you intellectually with their argument, you can bail by just simply making a prediction. If we let people do this, well, the next thing you know, they'll be doing that. Now, that's a slippery slope. You have no ability of knowing for sure, conclusively, that will happen just based on this. So, in a nutshell, a slippery slope argument is not an effective way to argue for several reasons. The most important one being that you're making a prediction about something you cannot prove, but you're making it in such a way that you're closing down any further discussion of that argument. Because now you're dealing not with facts, or you're dealing with hypothetical situations. And you cannot argue with hypothetical situations. The moment you're doing that, you're now engaged in falling down that slippery slope. Because now you can make up anything in order to win the argument. And that's not a good way to argue. Now, one important case in Canadian history, which occurred in the 1990s, is Sue Rodriguez. Sue Rodriguez, her decision on behalf of the Supreme Court, the second time she went up, not the first, her argument, her persistence allowed Canada to finally discuss seriously and put on the table legislation that would allow people the right to die, and made it part of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in the early 90s, that was not the case. Far from it. As a matter of fact, Sue Rodriguez was able to eventually win an argument that prohibited assisted suicide. She challenged that, saying that it was contrary to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that a terminally ill person does not have the choice to take their own life if they are suffering. Now, the first time, it was a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court to uphold the provisions in the criminal code that state that committing suicide is unlawful, and not only that it doesn't infringe on any of the rights and freedoms that we thought we actually had. Now let's look at that in more detail. So Sue Rodriguez was 42. She was diagnosed in 1992 with ALS, and the following year, with less than a year to live, we know in hindsight, she began this crusade to knock down Section 241 of the Criminal Code, which makes physician-assisted suicide illegal. So a physician cannot turn around and help you in committing suicide. Now, doctor-assisted suicide is what we're talking about here. This was not even legal at the time. It may have been done in Switzerland, for example, in parts of Europe, but certainly not in Canada and not legally. So what Sue Rodriguez did is she applied to the Supreme Court of Canada and asked them to look at Section 7 in particular. In fact, 3 of them. Section 7, having to do with life, liberty, and the security of the person, especially life and liberty. In other words, what can I do with my life, right? How much autonomy do I really have? Also, Section 12, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. She argued that suffering from ALS was cruel and unusual punishment, and she wished for it to end. And finally, Section 16 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms on equality, that she should be treated equally like another person. That just because she's ill or disabled means that somehow her voice doesn't count. Far from it. So here's how it played out. John Sopinka, writing in 1992, in the original ruling, the 5-4 ruling, said no, there was no violation of Section 7. So he thought that the prohibition against suicide engaged the right of the security of the person. He found that there was sufficient connection with the justice system so that the person's individual autonomy and right to life was such that doctor-assisted suicide would contravene it. So the right to life to cause physical and psychological pain, he said, no, it doesn't fit in this particular case. But Ms. Rodriguez continued. She fought on and said, no, look, it does exactly this. So although Sopinka had said, look, the right security of a person does not extend as far as doctor-assisted suicide. This is what essentially the ruling was. So he examined the history of the prohibition of suicide and said that no, it actually reflects the fundamental values of a society. Remember the moral values, and could not be used in violation of justice. In other words, the community standards indicated that doctor-assisted suicide was tantamount to murder. But it was equal to murder. So this is how the ruling first played out. And eventually it was overthrown. Sopinka also rejected the claims from Section 12, Section 7. And so eventually it took quite some time. And well after Sue Rodriguez had passed away, it was 22 years later. So from the early 90s to 2015, a decision was finally put through that said that denying assisted suicide in some cases actually violated Section 7 of the Charter. And as a result, this is what changed the community standards in such a way that people could now discuss the possibility of someone following through with doctor-assisted suicide. So we'll learn if you study poli-sci that governments never willingly hand things over. We have to fight for them. And if in this case it was the right to die through doctor-assisted suicide, then it took these kinds of cases in Canada to achieve it. So what are we left here when we talk about morality and ethics and reason and impartiality? Because we've just looked at 3 and 4, including Sue Rodriguez, very difficult cases. And depending on who you are, if you have a child, if you are, you've got young kids or young brothers and sisters, these 3 cases can hit you particularly hard and make you feel very emotional. But remember, when we're being reasonable and we're trying to be impartial, we have to make sure that our judgments are always backed by sound and ethical reasons, not by gut reactions or subjective opinions or the proverbial slippery slope, but instead that those moral judgments are always backed by sound and ethical reasons. Here is why I believe in the following. Because I believe in the sanctity of life. No, I believe that in certain cases that we can forfeit that because of the greater good. Whatever that is, those are sound and ethical reasons. So we have to be able to use those and rely on those in order to make a case one way or the other. So moral judgments need to be backed by sound and ethical reasons, not emotional outbursts. And two, moral judgments also require the impartial consideration of each individual's interests. Even if they are unconscious, even if they are too young to speak, we have to consider everyone's interests. So if you want to be reasonable and impartial, you have to do those two things. If you wish to be moral in your judgments, make sure that they are backed by ethical reasons and that you are impartial as you consider all of the facts. So that is very important. So how do we do this, right? If we wish to grasp the truth, even momentarily, we have to, and this is the hard part, we have to let our feelings be guided by reason, not by subjective emotions. Our feelings need to be guided by reason and by objectivity. So that is the essence of morality. That is the essence of thinking morally and thinking ethically, to be guided by reason and objectivity. And this kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that went into the categorical imperative that we'll look at in a few weeks, Kant's deontological position. We must always do the following. So Kant was guided by reason and objectivity because he believed, and many others do, that is the essence of morality. We ought to do a certain thing because it is correct, because we should and could do it under all conditions. So it is the morally right thing to do if that action is supported by reasonable arguments. If you turn around and say, I want to act this way because I want to punch some other guy in the head, no, that is violent. That is using a person as a means to an end because of your frustrations. That is not reason. That is not objectivity. So if someone says that something is morally wrong or right, they still need to back it up with reasons. Now, this particular module page or this panel, I think is very important. If you're thinking about writing your essay, think about these things. If you wish to write a good essay, let your feelings be guided by reason and objectivity. As well, if something is morally right or wrong, back it up. Back it up with good, solid reasons. And those reasons need to be legitimate. It isn't just force, or I say so, or I hate this, or it just makes me sick. That's not morality. That's not ethical. That's not an ethical argument. That's just simply someone responding. Somebody trying to push your buttons to think emotionally, which is a contradiction because it's one or the other. You're either thinking or you're emotional. In this case, you're thinking. You're trying to think about what makes something correct. So, 3 things to do. You want to get your facts right? Get them right and get them straight. Know all the facts in a particular case. 2, acknowledge that we have human prejudices, preconceptions, we have personal tastes, and those are shaped by a whole range of things. They could be shaped by where you live, your friends, your religious beliefs. All these things are preconceptions and personal taste. Now, that's not to say the religious beliefs are going to cloud your judgment. Do it the other way around. Use those as your firm foundation. So acknowledge it and say, this is the way I've been raised and taught. I believe that the sanctity of life is correct. And it may be a preconception, but it could be used as at the foundation for your argument, let's say against euthanasia or against capital punishment. So 3 things. Get the facts straight, acknowledge the prejudices and preconceptions and personal tastes that we have, and 3, abide by the moral principles that are representative of the position that you take. Because you can't kind of jump around and say, well, I shouldn't lie to anybody, but the moment you say that, you're no longer a deontologist, but a utilitarian. Now, if that's what you believe, that's still a position. That is still a utilitarian position. So whatever those moral principles are, which include not using people as a means to an end, killing another person to save, or killing one to save another, all those things, life is sacred, wrong to discriminate against a handicapped, whatever it is, those are the principles by which you will base your argument and construct your argument for or against a particular set of affairs. Euthanasia, capital punishment, abortion, whatever it may be. So, what is the most important thing we need to consider? It is impartiality. So, moral theories think that, or believe and assume that everyone's interests are going to be looked at equally. Now, with utilitarianism, there is some wiggle room, but we would like to think that we are impartial, that no one should get special treatment one way or the other, right? And because they are better or they are worse. Everybody should be treated equally. We shouldn't make exceptions, right? We shouldn't make exceptions because, for example, someone is disabled or mentally inferior, because the very case of Tracy Latimer was exactly that. So what is impartiality? It is that we treat no member of any particular group, however you wish to define that group, by age, by gender, by religious affiliation, whatever, that we treat no member of any particular group as inferior or unworthy of consideration. Again, no matter what your position, that moral judgment that you believe in has to be backed up with good reasons. So, the minimum concept of morality is that we try to guide our beliefs and our conduct by reason. It's always difficult in situations that we're very passionate about, because the very notion of passion sort of allows us to end up in a position of emotional upheaval. But even if you're passionate about something, you can still be reasonable. I could be passionate about euthanasia or capital punishment or whatever it happens to be. But my ideas, my passion is still conducted and tempered by my reason. And this is what is very, very important, right? We need to give equal weight to the interests of each individual that is affected by that decision, and think deeply about the conditions that each side finds itself in before you arrive at what you hope to be the right decision. Because a right decision is made using reason, and that's why it's good. Now, something that I want to point out here before we finish, at the end of each of the module, the PowerPoints, I put in key points. If you want to go back and look at these, you could even, if you like, you can look at these first and then go back and see how I use them. Either way, I'd like you to pay attention to the key points at the end of each of the modules, because this is where I gather information for the quizzes and for the midterm and the final tests. So the key points summarize in a matter of 2 or 3 panels the main arguments that we're looking at for that particular week. So in this case here, we're looking at morality. What is morality? It is the following. It's the study of principles or values concerning the difference between right and wrong actions or right and wrong behaviors. 2, it is also backed up by good reasons. 3, it is conducted as much as possible using impartiality. And 4, it's guided by reason and objectivity. So those 4 things constitute morality. We think about our principles and values, we back them up with reasons, we conduct it as much as possible being impartial and considering everyone's positions, and we guide those values and principles by reason and objectivity. So we looked at 3 cases. The first one of Baby Teresa. The argument 4 was that if we can benefit someone by without harming anyone else, we ought to do so. By the way, 4, that should say without harming, my mistake. Against, ethicists or deontologists argue that it is wrong to use people as a means to another end because it violates their autonomy. So in the case of Baby Teresa, we had to redefine exactly what we meant by death, by autonomy, by human being, to see that there was actually a third way, a middle way between these 2 positions. But Baby Teresa was, we can benefit more children with the harvesting of organs, therefore go ahead and euthanize Baby Teresa. Against, No, ethicists say absolutely not. That child is autonomous. We cannot kill them. The second one, Jody and Teresa, for and against. The rationale for separating the two twins was that we could be certain of saving at least one of them. So why not save one in the hopes of having that person live a substantially better life? And against, exactly the same thing, the sanctity of life. The parents both loved both their kids, did not want to kill one or the other, and wanted to just let basically their lives play out for as long as they could. But those, again, were the two main arguments. So for is clearly the utilitarian one. Against is the deontological one. The third was Tracy Latimer. For the fact that Tracy's life was merely biological, almost the equivalent of baby Teresa no longer being an autonomous person. Once they lose that autonomy, then the categories that define what is human being, what is death, now become more problematic and can be used to make a particular argument. So for is the utilitarian one, against the deontological one. Tracy's life was morally precious. Regardless of her disability, her father had no right to kill her. So those are the three difficult cases involving children, but you can see very clearly how the utilitarian versus the deontological positions, each have validity. That's what makes them controversial. It's difficult to say that one or the other is in fact correct. It just ultimately depends on what you believe in. What is your moral value system? And whichever it is, you're either for or against the following cases we just looked at. And then finally, we talked about the slippery slope. If we accept, in this case, euthanasia, there's the possibility that we could end up believing that all life is cheaper, and we should eliminate people that just get old. If they're a burden on society, we should do away with them. Thankfully, that's never happened. But this is what we mean by going down a slippery slope. If we allow something to occur, in the case of Canada, doctor-assisted suicide, there could be people that come along, later on and start making arguments on behalf of other people being allowed the right to die. So we need to be very, very careful that we don't go down that slippery slope, because it is not a very good way to argue, simply because you're just making things up. You're talking about hypothetical situations rather than facts and reasonable ideas that we can discuss. So that is basically Module 1B on what is morality. Remember, at the end of each of the modules will be the key points. Do have a look at those. And we will see you this time next week with Modules 2A and 2B. So take care, have a good week, and please do contact me if you have any questions on the material or questions about the course itself. So take care.